On May 2, 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into the disintegrating Third Reich, a special intelligence team arrived at a seemingly ordinary address in the Bavarian town of Oberammergau. The team was not searching for gold, art treasures, or high-ranking Nazi officials. They were hunting something the American government considered far more valuable: scientific knowledge. Specifically, they sought one man, Werner von Braun, the technical director of Nazi Germany's rocket program and the brilliant mind behind the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Von Braun and approximately 500 of his engineering team had deliberately positioned themselves to surrender to American rather than Soviet forces, understanding that their technical expertise made them extraordinarily valuable to whichever power captured them. The intelligence team found von Braun with his arm in a cast from a recent car accident, but otherwise healthy and cooperative. He had a simple message for his American captors. He and his team were ready to work, and they had much to offer. This encounter represented the beginning of one of the Cold War's most controversial and consequential operations, a secret American program to recruit German scientists, engineers and technicians whose expertise in rocketry, aeronautics, chemical weapons, and other advanced technologies could provide the United States with strategic advantages in the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. The program would eventually be codenamed Operation Paperclip, a bureaucratic reference to the paperclips attached to folders of German scientists being processed for American employment, distinguishing them from regular immigration cases. Over the next decade, Operation Paperclip would bring more than 1,600 German scientists and their families to the United States, fundamentally shaping American aerospace development, military technology, and eventually the space program. It would also generate profound moral controversies that persist to this day. As many of these scientists had been members of the Nazi Party, some had worked facilities using slave labor, and their recruitment required American officials to overlook or actively conceal their involvement with Nazi atrocities. The origins of Operation Paperclip lay in recognition by American military and intelligence officials that modern warfare increasingly depended on technological superiority, and that Nazi Germany, despite its monstrous ideology and ultimate defeat, had achieved remarkable advances in certain scientific and engineering fields. German jet aircraft were superior to Allied propeller-driven fighters. German submarines incorporated advanced technologies that made them difficult to detect and destroy. German chemical weapons research had produced nerve agents, sarin and tabun, far more lethal than anything in Allied arsenals. Most significantly, German rocket technology was years ahead of American or Soviet capabilities. The V-2 rocket, Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon 2, could carry a 1-ton warhead over 200 miles and reach altitudes of 50 miles, effectively creating the world's first space-capable vehicle. No other nation possessed comparable technology. American intelligence had been tracking German scientific advances throughout the war. The Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS, established in 1944, coordinated Allied efforts to locate and secure German scientific and industrial secrets before they could be destroyed or captured by Soviet forces. As Allied armies advanced into Germany in early 1945, CIOS teams followed closely behind combat units, racing to industrial facilities, research laboratories, and production plants to seize documents, equipment, and personnel before the chaos of Germany's collapse scattered or destroyed them. These teams understood they were engaged in what amounted to a treasure hunt, seeking intellectual property and human expertise that could provide enormous strategic advantages. The V-2 rocket program represented the crown jewel of this intellectual treasure. Developed at the Peenemünde research facility on Germany's Baltic coast and later produced at the Mittelwerk underground factory in the Harz Mountains, the V-2 represented a technological quantum leap. Between September 1944 and March 1945, Germany had launched over 3,000 V-2 rockets against Allied targets, primarily London and Antwerp. While the V-2's military impact was limited, the rockets were inaccurate and their warheads relatively small compared to conventional bombing. Their technological implications were profound. The V-2 demonstrated that ballistic missiles were feasible, that rockets could reach the edge of space, and that future warfare might involve weapons traveling at supersonic speeds against which no defense existed. Whoever mastered this technology would possess an enormous military advantage. Werner von Braun was the key to that technology. Born in 1912 to an aristocratic Prussian family, von Braun had been fascinated with rockets from childhood. He had studied physics and engineering, joining Germany's amateur rocket societies in the late 1920s before being recruited by the German army to develop military rockets in 1932, a year before Hitler came to power. Von Braun's brilliance as an engineer was matched by his skills at bureaucratic navigation and his ability to secure funding for increasingly ambitious projects. Under his technical leadership, the German rocket program evolved from small experimental devices to the V-2, a 46-foot-tall missile weighing over 27,000 pounds that represented the cutting edge of engineering. Achievement. Von Braun's relationship with the Nazi regime was complex and would become the central moral question surrounding his later American career. He joined the Nazi Party in 1937 and the SS in 1940, actions he would later characterize as necessary career moves rather than ideological commitments. His rocket work was supported by Heinrich Himmler's SS, and the Mittelwerk factory where V-2s were produced used slave labor from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. Approximately 20,000 slave laborers died at Mittelbau-Dora from brutal working conditions, starvation, and executions, more deaths than the V-2 rockets themselves caused when used as weapons. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk multiple times, witnessed the conditions there, and by some accounts personally selected skilled workers from among the concentration camp prisoners. The extent of his direct responsibility for the use of slave labor and the conditions prisoners endured would remain disputed, but his awareness of and involvement in a system dependent on slave labor was undeniable. As Germany's military situation deteriorated in early 1945, von Braun and his senior engineers recognized that their technical expertise represented their most valuable asset. They understood that both the Americans and Soviets would want to capture them and their knowledge. Von Braun favored surrender to the Americans, believing they would offer better treatment and more opportunities to continue rocket development than the Soviets would provide. He organized the evacuation of approximately 500 key personnel and their families from Peenemünde and later from Mittelwerk, moving them to Bavaria where they could position themselves to surrender to advancing American forces. Von Braun later described his decision to surrender to the Americans as the most important of his life, a decision that would determine not only his personal fate but the trajectory of space exploration for decades to come. The American intelligence team that located von Braun in May 1945 immediately recognized the magnitude of their find. Von Braun and his engineers represented the world's leading experts in rocket technology, and they were willing to work for the United States. The team quickly arranged for von Braun and his key personnel to be transported to American-controlled areas and interrogated by technical experts who could assess the full scope of their knowledge. Simultaneously, other American teams were racing to secure V-2 components, production equipment, and documentation before Soviet forces, advancing from the east, could capture them. The Mittelwerk factory, located in territory that would be assigned to Soviet occupation under agreements reached at Yalta, became the focus of frantic American efforts. In an operation later called Special Mission V-2, American forces dismantled and evacuated approximately 100 complete V-2 rockets and hundreds of tons of components, loading them onto trains and trucks for transport to American-controlled ports, all before the scheduled Soviet takeover of the region. This operation required speed and secrecy. The Americans were essentially looting a facility in what would become the Soviet occupation zone, taking equipment that under occupation agreements might be considered Soviet property. The operation succeeded, and by late May 1945, the V-2 rockets and components were en route to the United States, along with Werner von Braun and his key engineers. Simultaneously, Soviet forces were conducting their own operations to capture German scientists and technology. Soviet intelligence had been tracking German rocket development and understood its significance. When Soviet troops occupied Peenemünde and eventually took control of Mittelwerk, they found the facilities largely stripped of their most valuable equipment and personnel. The Soviets would eventually capture several hundred German rocket engineers and technicians, the personnel von Braun had not taken with him or who had chosen to remain, and transport them to the Soviet Union to work on Soviet rocket programs. The race for German rocket scientists had become the first competition of the Cold War, a contest that would shape the military balance and space race for decades. The legal and moral complications of recruiting German scientists were immediately apparent to American officials. Many of the scientists had been Nazi Party members. Some had ranks in the SS. Their work had directly supported Germany's war effort, and in some cases relied on slave labor that had killed thousands. Under American and Allied policies established for handling former Nazis, many of these individuals would be excluded from emigrating to the United States or receiving security clearances. Yet their technical knowledge was considered strategically vital. American officials faced a fundamental choice: adhere to policies designed to punish and exclude former Nazis, or bend those policies to acquire technical expertise deemed essential to national security. The decision was made to pursue the scientists despite the moral complications. The policy that emerged, initially called Operation Overcast before being renamed Operation Paperclip, created a framework for bringing German scientists to the United States on temporary contracts, with the possibility of permanent immigration later. The program was justified on national security grounds. The Soviet Union was also recruiting German scientists, and allowing the Soviets to monopolize this expertise would create unacceptable strategic imbalances. American officials convinced themselves that the scientists' technical knowledge outweighed concerns about their past, and that their work for the United States would be more valuable than any punishment they might receive for past activities. This decision required bureaucratic manipulation and deception that would become increasingly controversial as details emerged in later decades. Background investigations of German scientists often minimized or omitted information about Nazi Party membership, SS ranks, or involvement with slave labor. Security files were sanitized, removing or downplaying information that would disqualify candidates under existing immigration and security policies. Officials created cover stories explaining why exceptions were being made. The paperwork, literally, the papers clipped to folders of German scientists being processed, was altered to facilitate approval of cases that under normal procedures would have been denied. The name Operation Paperclip captured this bureaucratic reality. These were special cases, handled outside normal channels, with documentation adjusted to achieve desired outcomes. In September 1945, the first group of German rocket scientists arrived at Fort Strong in Boston Harbor, then were transferred to Fort Bliss in Texas and the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. Werner von Braun led the group, which included approximately 120 engineers and technicians essential to understanding and operating the V-2 technology the Americans had captured. The scientists were classified as War Department Special Employees, a designation that allowed them to work in the United States on temporary contracts without formal immigration. Their families remained in Germany, a situation that would persist for several years and served partly as leverage to ensure the scientists' cooperation and prevent defection. The mission assigned to von Braun's team was straightforward: help American engineers understand V-2 technology, assist in assembling and launching the captured V-2 rockets, and train Americans in rocket engineering. The United States Army, which controlled the program, wanted to learn everything possible from the German rockets and the men who had designed them. From 1946 to 1952, von Braun's team worked with American military personnel to launch over 60 V-2 rockets at White Sands, gathering data on rocket performance, developing guidance systems, and beginning to conceptualize more advanced rockets that could build on V-2 technology. The working conditions and treatment of the German scientists reflected the ambiguity of their status. They were not prisoners. They worked willingly under contract and were paid salaries comparable to American engineers. Yet they were not free. Their movements were restricted, they lived under military supervision, and they could not leave the country. They were neither enemy aliens subject to prosecution nor welcomed immigrants. They occupied a liminal space, valuable for their knowledge but suspect for their past, needed for national security but problematic for moral reasons. Werner von Braun adapted to this situation with characteristic pragmatism and charm. He learned English rapidly, cultivated relationships with American military officers and political figures, and made himself indispensable through his technical expertise and his ability to articulate ambitious visions for rocket development. Von Braun possessed not only engineering brilliance but also public relations skills and political acumen. He understood that his future in America depended on making himself valuable and acceptable, on demonstrating that he was an asset worth the moral compromises his employment required. He positioned himself not as a former Nazi, but as a scientist who had always been interested primarily in space exploration, who had worked for Germany because that was where he could develop rockets, but whose true passion was reaching beyond Earth, a narrative that minimized his Nazi associations while emphasizing his contributions to human knowledge. Other German scientists brought to America under Operation Paperclip worked in fields beyond rocketry. Kurt Blom had been involved in Nazi biological warfare research, conducting experiments that killed concentration camp prisoners. He was tried at Nuremberg for war crimes, but acquitted due to insufficient evidence, then recruited by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps to work on biological weapons. Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine, had worked on Luftwaffe aviation medicine research that included experiments on concentration camp prisoners subjected to extreme conditions. Walter Schreiber had directed medical research for the German military, including studies involving human experimentation. These and other German scientists recruited under Paperclip brought expertise in chemical weapons, aviation medicine, and other fields where Nazi Germany had conducted research, often through unethical or criminal means. The recruitment of scientists with such backgrounds generated opposition within American government agencies and from some American scientists who objected to employing individuals complicit in Nazi atrocities. The State Department, responsible for immigration policy, repeatedly raised concerns about Paperclip scientists whose backgrounds included Nazi Party membership or worse. Scientists at several American universities refused to work with some of the German recruits, objecting to their wartime activities. Jewish organizations protested the program when details began to emerge. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover expressed concerns about security risks posed by bringing former Nazis into sensitive military programs. These objections were overridden by military and intelligence officials who argued that national security required acquiring this expertise regardless of moral complications. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, which administered Operation Paperclip, actively worked to overcome State Department objections and facilitate the scientists' immigration. GIOA Director Bosquet Webb wrote in a 1948 memo that the best interests of the United States have been subjugated to the efforts expended in beating a dead Nazi horse. This sentiment, that concerns about the scientists' Nazi pasts were less important than their technical value, characterized the program's administration and reflected broader Cold War logic that would prioritize strategic advantage over moral considerations. The most significant bureaucratic battle concerned whether the German scientists would be allowed to remain permanently in the United States and eventually become citizens. Their initial contracts were temporary, but military planners recognized that the scientists would be most valuable if they remained permanently, fully integrating into American military research programs. Permanent residency required formal immigration, which meant the scientists had to pass background checks under immigration law that excluded former Nazis. The JIOA addressed this problem by sanitizing the scientists' security files, removing or minimizing information about Nazi Party membership, SS ranks, and involvement in war crimes. When State Department officials requested complete files on scientists being considered for immigration, JIOA provided edited versions that omitted problematic information. This deception was deliberate and systematic. A 1947 report by the State Department's Office of the U. Legal Advisor noted that GIOA was providing grossly incomplete information about the German scientists and that, in no case have any of the scientists involved been subjected to the type of investigation which is required. Despite these objections, the program continued, with military and intelligence officials successfully arguing that strategic necessities justified exceptions to normal procedures. By 1949, the Paperclip scientists were being granted permanent residency, and by the mid-1950s, many had become American citizens, their Nazi pasts officially overlooked or forgiven in the interest of Cold War competition. The Soviet Union's parallel program to recruit German scientists created the competitive dynamic that justified Operation Paperclip in American strategic thinking. The Soviets had captured several hundred German rocket engineers and other specialists who had not escaped to the American zone. These scientists were transported to the Soviet Union, where they worked on Soviet rocket programs until the mid-1950s. However, Soviet treatment of German scientists differed from the American approach. The Soviets never fully trusted the Germans, kept them under tight security, and used their knowledge primarily to accelerate Soviet understanding of German technology, rather than integrating them into long-term Soviet programs. By the late 1950s, most German scientists in the Soviet Union had been sent back to East Germany, having served their purpose of transferring knowledge to Soviet engineers. The American program was more extensive and ultimately more consequential. The United States brought more German scientists, gave them more responsibility in American programs, and integrated them more thoroughly into American scientific and military institutions. Wernher von Braun and his rocket team became the core of American ballistic missile and space programs, eventually leading the development of the rockets that would put Americans in space and on the moon. Other paperclip scientists contributed to American chemical weapons programs, aviation research, and various military technologies. The knowledge transfer was not just temporary assistance but fundamental integration of German expertise into American capabilities. The moral complications of this integration became increasingly apparent over time. In 1946, Arthur Rudolph, who had been production manager at Mittelwerk, where slave labor built V-2 rockets, arrived in the United States under Operation Paperclip. American investigators had documented that Rudolph had direct responsibility for manufacturing operations where prisoners died from brutal working conditions. Yet this information was minimized in his security file, and Rudolph became a key figure in American rocket programs, eventually serving as project director for the Saturn V rocket that would carry astronauts to the moon. Only in 1984, when investigators re-examined his wartime activities, would Rudolph agree to renounce his American citizenship and leave the country rather than face deportation proceedings. This pragmatic calculation reflected a broader American approach to Cold War competition that would sacrifice moral principles for strategic advantage. The same logic that justified Operation Paperclip would later justify American support for authoritarian regimes, American involvement in coups against democratically elected governments, and various covert operations that violated stated American values. Operation Paperclip was an early example of a pattern that would characterize Cold War policy. When moral considerations conflicted with perceived strategic necessities, strategic considerations prevailed. The scientific community's response to Operation Paperclip was mixed. Some American scientists welcomed the German experts, recognizing their technical achievements and eager to learn from them. Others refused to collaborate with individuals they considered complicit in Nazi atrocities. Albert Einstein, when asked about employing German scientists, reportedly stated that he would never work with anyone who had served the Nazi regime. The American scientific establishment was divided between those who believed science should be separated from politics and those who insisted that scientists bore moral responsibility for how their knowledge was used and whom they served. Wernher von Braun navigated these complications through a combination of technical excellence, personal charm, and calculated image management. He portrayed himself as an apolitical scientist who had been interested only in space exploration, who had worked for Germany because that was where he could pursue his passion, but whose loyalty was to scientific advancement rather than any particular government. This narrative, while convenient, was historically incomplete. Von Braun had been deeply embedded in Nazi military programs, had benefited from slave labor, and had made choices that prioritized his rocket work over moral objections to the regime he served. His American reinvention required forgetting or explaining away these realities. By the early 1950s, Operation Paperclip had achieved its immediate objectives. The United States had acquired German scientific expertise that accelerated American capabilities in multiple fields. The rocket knowledge gained from von Braun's team contributed directly to American ballistic missile development, giving the United States capabilities it would not have possessed for years without German assistance. Chemical weapons research benefited from German work on nerve agents. Aviation medicine advanced through German research, even when that research had been conducted unethically. From a purely strategic perspective, Operation Paperclip had been successful. The United States had gained advantages over the Soviet Union through acquiring and employing German scientific knowledge. The program's expansion in scope reflected its perceived success. What had begun as a temporary program to exploit captured German expertise evolved into permanent integration of German scientists into American institutions. Wernher von Braun, became an American citizen in 1955, and eventually became director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, leading the development of the Saturn rockets that would power America's space program. His public profile grew enormously. He appeared on television, collaborated with Walt Disney on educational programs about space exploration, and became one of America's most recognized scientists. The former SS officer who had overseen rocket production using slave labor had transformed into an American hero, a symbol of America's space ambitions. Other paperclip scientists followed similar trajectories, building successful careers in American military and civilian research institutions. They published papers, received awards, trained American students, and contributed to American technological leadership. Their Nazi pasts became increasingly distant memories, mentioned if at all as youthful mistakes or unfortunate necessities of wartime service, not as disqualifying moral failures. The pragmatic calculation that had justified their recruitment seemed vindicated by their contributions to American capabilities. The consequences of Operation Paperclip extended far beyond the individual scientists involved. The program established precedents for how the United States would balance moral principles against strategic interests during the Cold War. It demonstrated that American stated values, commitment to justice, rejection of totalitarianism, prosecution of war criminals, could be set aside when security considerations seemed to require it. It showed that the United States would employ individuals whose actions violated American values if their expertise provided strategic advantages. These precedents influenced subsequent American policies and operations throughout the Cold War and beyond. The space program became Operation Paperclip's most visible legacy when President John F. Kennedy announced in 1961 that America would send a man to the moon before the decade's end. The team that would make this possible was led by Werner von Braun and included numerous other former German rocket engineers. The Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon was designed under von Braun's leadership by a team that included many Operation Paperclip recruits. On July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, the achievement represented the culmination of work begun in Nazi Germany, continued by former Nazi engineers now working for America, and justified throughout as necessary for strategic competition with the Soviet Union. This reality created complicated questions about how to evaluate the moon landing and the broader space program. Was it compromised by its origins in Nazi rocket development and its dependence on scientists complicit in war crimes? Or should the scientific achievement be separated from the moral complications of how it was accomplished? These questions generated different answers depending on perspective and values, and they remain unresolved in historical and ethical discussions of the space program. The secrecy surrounding Operation Paperclip began to erode in the 1970s and 1980s as journalists and researchers obtained declassified documents through Freedom of Information Act requests. What emerged was detailed documentation of how scientists' Nazi backgrounds had been sanitized, how officials had deliberately concealed information to facilitate immigration approvals, and how individuals with documented involvement in war crimes had been brought to America and given positions in sensitive military programs. These revelations generated public controversy and renewed debate about whether the program had been justified. The case of Arthur Rudolph became particularly significant when investigators in the 1980s re-examined his wartime role at Mittelwerk. Evidence showed that Rudolph had direct authority over production operations where slave laborers died from brutal conditions, that he had been present during hangings of prisoners accused of sabotage, and that survivors identified him as responsible for the deadly conditions. Faced with deportation proceedings in 1984, Rudolph agreed to renounce his American citizenship and return to West Germany rather than contest the charges. His departure forced public reckoning with the fact that a man who had received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal and led development of the Saturn V rocket had been complicit in mass death through slave labor. Other cases followed. In 1985, the U.S. Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations, established to identify and prosecute Nazi war criminals living in America, began investigating Operation Paperclip scientists. The investigations revealed that numerous scientists had lied on immigration applications, concealing Nazi Party membership and SS ranks. Some had been directly involved in medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners. Others had worked at facilities where slave labor was employed. The Justice Department faced the question of what to do about individuals who had been in America for decades, had contributed to American programs, but had gained entry through false statements and concealed involvement in war crimes. The legal and political complications were substantial. Many of the scientists were elderly by the 1980s. Prosecuting them decades after their crimes raised questions about statute of limitations and fairness of delayed justice. Their contributions to American programs created constituencies who defended them, arguing that their service to America should be weighed against wartime actions. Some scientists had powerful advocates in the aerospace industry, military, and Congress who opposed investigations that might embarrass American institutions or reveal the extent of official complicity in bringing war criminals to America. The historical evaluation of Operation Paperclip remains contentious. Defenders argue that the program was strategically necessary, that the Cold War posed existential threats requiring pragmatic responses, and that the scientists' contributions to American capabilities justified the moral compromises. They point to the moon landing, to American ballistic missile capabilities that helped maintain deterrence against Soviet aggression, and to various technological advances as evidence that Operation Paperclip served American interests. They argue that the Soviet Union's parallel recruitment of German scientists meant that America had no choice but to compete in this domain, and that allowing the Soviets to monopolize German expertise would have been strategically irresponsible. Critics counter that Operation Paperclip represented a fundamental betrayal of stated American values, that employing individuals complicit in war crimes undermined American moral authority, and that the purported strategic benefits did not justify the costs. They note that American scientists and engineers could have developed rocket technology without German assistance, perhaps more slowly, but without moral compromise. They argue that the program sent a message that expertise could excuse even grave crimes, that useful individuals would be shielded from justice, and that American principles were negotiable when convenient. They point out that many paperclip scientists never faced accountability for their actions, living comfortable lives in America while victims of Nazi atrocities received no justice. The question of what America actually gained from Operation Paperclip versus what it would have achieved without the program is fundamentally counterfactual and therefore impossible to answer definitively. American scientists were already working on rocket technology before the German scientists arrived. Robert Goddard, an American physicist, had pioneered liquid fuel rocketry in the 1920s and 1930s, though his work received limited support. The United States had substantial scientific and industrial capabilities that could have been directed toward rocket development. Whether America would have reached the moon in 1969 without German assistance, or would have developed comparable ballistic missiles on a similar timeline, cannot be known with certainty. What is clear is that von Braun and his team accelerated American rocket development, that they brought knowledge and experience that shortened American learning curves, and that their contributions were significant. Whether these contributions were so valuable as to justify employing individuals with their backgrounds remains a matter of judgment about values and priorities. The calculation requires weighing tangible technical advances against intangible moral costs, comparing strategic benefits against ethical compromises, a calculation that different people, applying different values, will resolve differently. The broader impact of Operation Paperclip on American institutions and culture is easier to assess. The program established that technical expertise could outweigh moral considerations in government decision-making. It demonstrated that security classifications could conceal morally problematic programs from public scrutiny and democratic accountability. It showed that bureaucratic processes could be manipulated to achieve outcomes that formal policies would prohibit. These precedents influenced how American intelligence and military agencies would operate throughout the Cold War, creating patterns of behavior where classified programs operated outside normal legal and ethical constraints, justified by national security imperatives, that were themselves classified and therefore not subject to democratic debate. Operation Paperclip also influenced American immigration and refugee policy in ways that extended beyond the specific scientists involved. The program created precedents for how the United States would admit individuals who would normally be excluded, establishing that strategic value could override normal immigration criteria. This approach would be applied in subsequent decades to various groups: anti-communist Cubans, Southeast Asian allies after the Vietnam War, Iraqi translators after the Iraq War, where strategic or humanitarian considerations justified exceptions to normal immigration procedures. The principle that America's national interests could justify bringing in individuals who would otherwise be excluded became an established aspect of immigration policy. The scientific legacy of Operation Paperclip is embedded throughout American aerospace and military technology. Engineers trained by von Braun and other German scientists went on to lead American programs, passing along knowledge and approaches derived from German work. The institutional culture of American rocket development was shaped by German methodologies and perspectives. Even today, American spacecraft and missiles reflect design philosophies and engineering approaches that trace back to German roots. This technical inheritance is so thoroughly integrated into American capabilities that separating German contributions from indigenous American development is impossible. They have merged into a hybrid tradition that is neither purely German nor purely American, but something created through their combination. The personal stories of Operation Paperclip scientists who lived out their lives in America reflect the complexity of the program. Most adapted successfully to American life, raising families, building careers, and becoming, by outward measures, ordinary American citizens. Some expressed regret about their wartime activities, though often in qualified terms that emphasized their focus on scientific work rather than political or moral questions. Others maintained that they had done nothing wrong, that they had been scientists doing scientific work, that they bore no responsibility for how their work was used or the conditions under which it was performed. Very few accepted full moral responsibility for their participation in Nazi programs or acknowledged the human cost of their work. Wernher von Braun's evolution in America exemplified this pattern. He became wealthy, famous, and celebrated. He received honorary degrees from universities. He advised presidents. He inspired a generation of Americans to dream of space exploration. He maintained until his death in 1977 that he had always been interested primarily in space, that his work for Nazi Germany had been a regrettable necessity, and that his true achievement was advancing humanity's reach beyond Earth. This narrative allowed him and his admirers to focus on his contributions while minimizing his complicity in Nazi crimes. Whether this narrative was self-deception, calculated public relations, or some combination remains debated. The comparison with how other nations handled similar situations provides perspective on American choices. The Soviet Union, as noted, recruited German scientists but never fully integrated them, using them temporarily, then returning them to Germany. Britain conducted a smaller program similar to Paperclip, but with more restrictive criteria, excluding individuals with clear war crimes connections. France also recruited some German scientists, but on a more limited scale. None of these programs matched the American effort in scope or in the extent to which recruited scientists were integrated into national programs and eventually celebrated as national assets. The moral framework for evaluating Operation Paperclip requires balancing multiple considerations. There is the utilitarian calculation. Did the program produce benefits, technological advances, lives saved through deterrence, scientific knowledge gained, that outweighed the costs of employing individuals complicit in atrocities? There is the deontological question. Were certain actions inherently wrong regardless of consequences, such that employing war criminals violated absolute moral principles that should not have been compromised? There is the question of justice. Did allowing these individuals to escape accountability for their crimes constitute a failure of justice that undermined the legitimacy of post-war trials and punishments of other Nazis? These different ethical frameworks produce different evaluations, and no single framework clearly resolves the question. The victims of Nazi atrocities, including survivors of Mittelbau Dora, where V-2 rockets were produced using slave labor, have offered perspectives that add moral weight to evaluations of Operation Paperclip. Survivors who witnessed the conditions at Mittelwerk, who saw prisoners die from brutal treatment while building rockets, who experienced or witnessed the casual cruelty of the system that von Braun and others served, have described the profound injustice of seeing these individuals celebrated in America while their victims received minimal recognition or compensation. For these survivors and their families, Operation Paperclip represented a betrayal, an indication that the stated commitment to justice for Nazi crimes was conditional and could be set aside for convenience. The documentary Record of Operation Paperclip, now largely declassified, provides detailed evidence of how the program operated and the official thinking that justified it. Memoranda from military and intelligence officials show clear awareness that they were bending rules, concealing information, and prioritizing strategic considerations over moral ones. These officials were not naive about what they were doing. They understood the ethical problems, but concluded that national security required accepting these problems. The documentary record also shows State Department and FBI objections being systematically overridden, demonstrating that there was internal opposition to the program that was defeated by those who prioritized technical acquisition above other considerations. The question of whether Operation Paperclip was necessary, whether the United States faced threats so severe that employing former Nazis was the only viable response, is central to moral evaluation. If the Soviet threat truly was existential, if the only way to maintain security was to acquire German expertise, then the program might be justified as a tragic necessity. If, however, American capabilities could have developed adequately without German scientists, or if the advantages gained were marginal rather than decisive, then the program represents an unnecessary moral compromise. Historical evidence suggests the truth lies somewhere between these extremes. The German scientists provided real advantages, but probably not ones so critical that American security depended on them. The cultural impact of Operation Paperclip extended into popular culture and public consciousness in ways that shaped how Americans understood both World War II and the Cold War. The transformation of German rocket scientists from enemies to allies, from servants of Hitler to servants of America, reinforced narratives about the Cold War that emphasized anti-communism above all else, that portrayed the Soviet Union as a greater threat than Nazi Germany had been, and that justified pragmatic alliances with morally problematic individuals if they served anti-communist purposes. This narrative framework influenced American policy throughout the Cold War and created patterns of thinking that persist in American strategic culture. The space program's dependence on Operation Paperclip scientists created particular complications for how Americans remembered and celebrated space achievements. The moon landing is widely regarded as one of humanity's great achievements, a moment when human beings first walked on another world. Yet this achievement was led by individuals whose earlier work had been done for Nazi Germany and had relied on slave labor. This tension between the nobility of the achievement and the problematic nature of some of its architects creates cognitive dissonance that Americans have generally resolved by focusing on the former while minimizing the latter. The celebration of space achievements has largely separated them from their origins, treating them as American accomplishments while underemphasizing the German roots. The institutional legacy of Operation Paperclip within NASA and the military aerospace complex has been preserved through organizational cultures, technical approaches, and human networks that persist decades after the original Paperclip scientists retired or died. Engineers who trained under von Braun trained subsequent generations, passing along not just technical knowledge, but approaches to problem-solving and organizational methods derived from German traditions. The influence is now so attenuated and mixed with indigenous American traditions that it is no longer distinctly German, but the genealogy remains traceable. The comparison between Operation Paperclip and the Nuremberg trials, which were occurring simultaneously in 1945-1946, highlights the contradictions in American post-war policy toward former Nazis. At Nuremberg, the United States prosecuted German officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression, establishing principles of individual accountability and rejecting defenses based on superior orders or state necessity. Simultaneously, Operation Paperclip was recruiting individuals who might have faced prosecution under Nuremberg principles, offering them not punishment but employment, and concealing their backgrounds to facilitate this employment. This contradiction undermined the moral clarity of Nuremberg, suggesting that accountability applied only to those who lacked skills America wanted to exploit. In 2014, Annie Jacobsen published Operation Paperclip, The secret intelligence program that brought Nazi scientists to America, drawing on newly declassified documents to provide the most comprehensive account of the program. Her research revealed details of individual scientists' backgrounds that had remained obscure, documented the extent of official efforts to sanitize their histories, and provided evidence about their wartime activities from German records and survivor testimony. The book reignited public debate about Operation Paperclip, forcing reconsideration of a program that had been largely accepted or forgotten. The revelations did not significantly change the historical consensus about the program's basic facts. Historians had understood for decades that Operation Paperclip involved recruiting former Nazis and sanitizing their backgrounds. What the new documentation provided was detail about specific individuals, evidence of just how much officials knew about the scientists' backgrounds, and documentation of the deliberate deception involved. This detail made abstract moral questions concrete. It is one thing to debate in principle whether employing former Nazis was justified, another to read specific documents showing that particular individuals participated in particular atrocities yet were deliberately brought to America, and their pasts concealed. The current status of Operation Paperclip in American historical memory is complex. The program is generally known in outline. Most educated Americans are aware that German scientists, including von Braun, worked on the American space program. But the details of their backgrounds, the extent of their involvement in Nazi crimes, and the moral compromises their employment represented are less widely understood. The space program is celebrated without extensive attention to these origins, allowing Americans to take pride in the achievement while avoiding uncomfortable questions about its foundations. The lessons of Operation Paperclip for contemporary policy debates remain relevant. The program demonstrates how security classifications can shield morally problematic activities from democratic scrutiny. It shows how expertise can be valued above character or past actions when strategic interests seem to require it. It illustrates how bureaucratic processes can be manipulated to achieve outcomes that formal policies prohibit. It reveals how institutional interests, in this case military and intelligence agencies seeking technical advantages, can override other considerations, including justice and stated values. These patterns have recurred in American policy repeatedly since Paperclip, suggesting that the program established precedents that continue to influence how American national security institutions operate. The question of whether Operation Paperclip should have been conducted differently, with more stringent criteria excluding those complicit in war crimes, with more transparency about scientists' backgrounds, with different arrangements that acquired knowledge without employing the individuals who had developed it for Nazi Germany, remains hypothetical but instructive. Such an approach might have been morally preferable but strategically less effective, or it might have achieved similar strategic outcomes with fewer moral costs. The fact that this alternative was not seriously considered, that strategic considerations dominated from the start, reflects Cold War logic that would characterize American policy for decades. The veterans of Operation Paperclip who lived to see their story become public had varied reactions. Some maintained they had done nothing wrong. Others acknowledged moral complications but argued their contributions to America justified their recruitment. A few expressed regret, though usually in measured terms. None faced meaningful accountability. By the time investigations occurred in the 1980s, most were elderly, prosecutions were legally complicated, and political will to pursue them was limited. They had lived most of their lives in America, raised families, built careers, and become in many respects ordinary citizens. Holding them accountable decades after their crimes, for actions taken in service of a regime long since destroyed, presented practical and philosophical challenges that American institutions largely chose not to confront. The families of Operation Paperclip scientists, particularly second and third generations born in America, have sometimes struggled with revelations about their parents' or grandparents' backgrounds. Learning that a respected father or grandfather had been involved in Nazi programs, had worked at facilities using slave labor, or had concealed past activities to gain entry to America, creates personal crises about family identity and moral inheritance. Some families have acknowledged these complicated histories openly. Others have defended their relatives or minimized their involvement. The personal dimension of Operation Paperclip, how it affected families across generations, is part of its legacy. The survivors of Nazi atrocities and their descendants represent another group affected by Operation Paperclip's legacy. For them, the program represents a failure of justice and a demonstration that even the most severe crimes can be overlooked when perpetrators possess valuable skills. The fact that individuals who benefited from or participated in systems that killed their relatives lived comfortable lives in America while victims struggled with trauma and received limited recognition or compensation represents a profound injustice. Their perspective is crucial for moral evaluation of Operation Paperclip, though it has often been marginalized in discussions that focus on strategic benefits or scientific achievements. The archives that document Operation Paperclip, personnel files, correspondence, technical reports, photographs, constitute an extraordinary historical record of how states balance moral principles against strategic interests, how bureaucracies operate when official policies conflict with strategic objectives, and how individuals navigate between different moral universes. These documents show scientists presenting themselves differently to different audiences, officials constructing narratives to justify problematic decisions, and systems adapting to achieve desired outcomes despite formal constraints. They provide material for endless historical and ethical analysis. The question of what Operation Paperclip reveals about American character and values produces discomfort precisely because the answer is ambiguous. The program shows American pragmatism and willingness to adapt principles to circumstances, which can be seen as admirable flexibility or as moral relativism. It shows American focus on results over process, which can be seen as effective problem-solving or as ends justify means thinking. It shows American faith that individuals can be redeemed through changed circumstances, which can be seen as generous hopefulness or as naive willingness to forget the past. These different interpretations reflect different values and produce different judgments about what the program means. Werner von Braun died in 1977, having lived 32 years in America, longer than he lived in Germany. He died celebrated as a pioneer of space exploration, a visionary who helped humanity reach the moon. His obituaries mentioned his Nazi past but emphasized his American contributions. He was buried in Alexandria, Virginia, an American citizen who had achieved American success. His complicated legacy, brilliant engineer, servant of Hitler, pioneer of spaceflight, symbol of moral compromise, remained unresolved at his death and remains disputed today. The final assessment of Operation Paperclip depends ultimately on how one weighs competing values and priorities. If technical achievement and strategic advantage are paramount, if the ends of national security justify morally problematic means, if expertise should be separated from moral judgment about how it was acquired, then Operation Paperclip can be defended as a necessary program that served American interests effectively. If justice for victims is paramount, if stated principles should be maintained even at strategic cost, if complicity in atrocities should disqualify individuals from positions of honor regardless of their skills, then Operation Paperclip represents an indefensible betrayal of values America claimed to defend. Most people, examining the historical record honestly, find themselves somewhere between these poles, recognizing both that the program provided real strategic benefits and that it involved real moral compromises, acknowledging both the scientists' contributions and their past crimes, understanding both why officials made the decisions they did and why those decisions were problematic. This ambivalence is uncomfortable, lacking the clarity of unqualified condemnation or celebration, but it may be the most honest response to a program that exemplified the moral complexities of the Cold War. The rockets that von Braun and his team designed launched American astronauts to the moon, sent probes throughout the solar system, and contributed to American military capabilities that helped maintain deterrence through decades of Cold War tension. These achievements are real and significant, but they were built on foundations that included slave labor, Nazi ideology, and American willingness to employ individuals complicit in atrocities. This reality does not negate the achievements but complicates them, adding moral shadows to technological triumphs. Operation Paperclip remains a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about how nations behave when security interests conflict with stated values, how individuals rationalize compromising principles for practical benefits, and how history remembers moral compromises when they produce successful outcomes. The program succeeded in its strategic objectives while failing its moral tests. It brought brilliant scientists to America while bringing unacknowledged criminals. It advanced American capabilities while advancing individuals who should perhaps have faced justice rather than reward. It represents both American ingenuity in exploiting opportunities and American willingness to sacrifice principles for advantage. The story of Operation Paperclip has no simple conclusion because the questions it raises about the relationship between scientific knowledge and moral responsibility, about whether expertise can excuse complicity in evil, about how societies should balance justice against strategic necessity, have no simple answers. These questions remain relevant decades after the program ended, applicable to contemporary debates about recruiting foreign talent, about how nations should respond to individuals whose skills are valuable but whose pasts are problematic, about the relationship between stated values and practical policy. In the end, Operation Paperclip achieved its objectives. The United States acquired German scientific expertise, gained strategic advantages over the Soviet Union, and built aerospace capabilities that would not have developed as quickly without German contributions. These successes came at moral costs that can be catalogued but not precisely measured. Justice deferred or denied for victims. Principles compromised for convenience. Individuals rewarded who might have been punished. Whether the benefits justified the costs remains a question each person must answer based on their own values and their own judgment about what matters most in how nations should behave. The German scientists who came to America under Operation Paperclip are nearly all dead now. Their lives concluded, their contributions made, their moral reckonings postponed until history's final judgment. They transformed from enemies to allies, from servants of Hitler to servants of America, from war criminals to pioneering scientists. They helped send humans to the moon while never fully accounting for their roles in systems that sent humans to death camps. They were brilliant and complicit, accomplished and compromised, valuable and problematic, complex human beings whose stories resist simple moral categorization, whose legacies remain disputed, whose lives embodied the moral ambiguities of the Cold War era when strategic necessities repeatedly trumped moral clarity, and the future was built on foundations best left unexamined.